Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Today I would like to introduce to you, perhaps discuss a little bit, a novel from Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, written in 1990 by somebody called Dermot Bolger. And the name of the novel is The Journey Home. Now, The Journey Home is a novel of about 350 pages, perhaps, that represents quite a break, perhaps, with the traditional expectations from Irish fiction until that time. And so this novel is really interesting on multiple levels. It is a very good novel in its own right. It's very pacey. Lots of things happen. There is a mystery, different mysteries. There is a real sense of the story going towards something, and we want to know that something. But these are not the only reasons why this novel is really interesting to talk about. And so I would like to give you three sort of objective reasons that go beyond the novel itself. And perhaps at the end of this video, you will rush out to buy that novel and read it. Those three reasons are going to be one, the idea of the novel beyond itself, as it were, the novel as a political vehicle, as it were. The second reason will be the city as character. Now, the character has long been, of course, organic, as it were, in stories. The city has also long been a setting for many, many narratives. But here, perhaps the city will become more than a setting. It will become a character itself in the story. And finally, we'll say a couple of words about Irish fiction in general, but much more specifically about the 90s in the Republic of Ireland, when it comes to a new wave of new voices and new ways of expressing new identities, perhaps, in Ireland. So, that's the program. Let's get going with the first aspect of this novel that is really interesting, is the novel as a political instrument. Now, typically, of course, when we think about novels, we think about a narrative, a story in which events will take place, typically distributed over a number of characters and settings, perhaps, and the like. Now, we know, of course, that when we read literature, we are primarily interested in not the surface level, that is the story level. We are interested, of course, is in finding out what the surface level carries in terms of ideas and themes. And typically, of course, it could be that war is a terrible thing, or friendship wins in the end, or love is great. All those are, of course, very broad themes that have been treated time and again in literature. At the same time, there are novels that perhaps should be seen as an instrument to perhaps attack something specifically, or discuss a certain aspect of perhaps society, for example, or mankind, and bring about a specific view, a specific set of ideas about that very subject they're investigating. So, therefore, a novel can become a way to hammer at an idea and perhaps strike a blow, or 10 or 20, at a specific conceptual idea, societal idea, political idea, financial organization, way to think, and all those things. In other words, here we could say that the plot, the surface level, is really in the service of not only the themes, the undercurrent sort of themes that we'll discuss today, of course, but also simply as a vehicle to carry an idea. And that idea is represented through, of course, the narrative itself, the events, the characters, how they interact, what happens to them, who they meet, as usual. And all this is dedicated really to an idea. I want to exemplify this. I want to show this. I want to show how bad this is. I want to show what has gone wrong. Of course, you can do that in a satirical way. Think about here, for example, the absolutely wonderful What a Carve Up by Jonathan Coe, English writer. And Jonathan Coe, it's a long cry of rage. It's a long attack, what a carve up on really the a certain type of political persons in England in the 80s, 70s, 80s, 90s. A certain way of thinking about politics in England and a certain way of thinking in terms of class systems and what all that means for the rest of us. It's an absolutely wonderful novel. It is an extremely funny novel, but the satire is obviously directed at a political message. It is there to carry a political message and to make it more palatable, perhaps enjoyable for those who don't want to hear a long discourse about politics and who want to be entertained when they read. And Jonathan Coe, for example, does that extremely well. Now, here, what are we talking about? Well, we're talking about a novel that follows a teenager, and his name is Franny Haino, it becomes afterwards. And in the beginning, he's just a sort of typical teenager, really. He's sort of just left his family. His family comes from the countryside of Ireland, and they moved for economic reasons, really, to the outskirts of Dublin, the capital of the Republic. And Haino himself, well, he is sort of in between those two areas, and which, of course, are also two identities. He moved to the outskirts of Dublin. He's not quite in Dublin, but it is certainly the working class suburbs of Dublin. So a sort of scale up, as it were, from where his parents come from, in terms of urbanization, in terms of modernity, perhaps, but not quite there yet, of course, not quite integrated in the great metropolis itself. And what's going to happen to Haino? Well, he's going to meet a young guy, a little bit older, and through him is going to get caught in different adventures. And those adventures really are related to the idea of corruption. And corruption organizing the whole of society, as it were. Now, where does that corruption come from? That's what Haino will discover little by little through meeting different types of, or different groups or types of people involved in that corruption, among which you've got your petty criminals, as it were, of course. You've got the hardline criminals, the really tough one. You've got politicians, and you've got also people involved with Ireland, but not necessarily in the sense that we understand, because, as you may remember, this novel came out in 1990. In 1990, of course, is right bang still in the middle of the Troubles. Okay, it had already slowed down quite markedly from the 60s and the 70s, of course, but the Troubles which were taking place in Northern Ireland were directly and indirectly, of course, influencing or having an impact on the Republic of Ireland itself, quite simply because there were two groups involved in the Troubles, very broadly speaking, of course, I'm simplifying, but on one hand you had the loyalist Protestant who looked towards the UK, and on the other hand you had the Catholic nationalists, as it were, who themselves looked to the Republic of Ireland and the reunification of the Republic of Ireland. And those people, of course, had ties with some in the Republic of Ireland. What Bolger is interested here is really using the narrative and the thriller-like narrative, the detective-like narrative, to examine different aspects of this political situation. And the problem being, of course, that corruption taking place through so many different levels and layers of the society is very difficult to sort of identify one strand of, or two strands of. Every time you sort of unravel something, you find that different categories, different groups of people are also involved. And so it becomes very difficult to know who's in charge of what. But what Haino does find, of course, is that people like him are just puppets, really, in the hands of people whose interest is not in a country, not in the Republic of Ireland, not in the future of the Irish people, nor really is their interest in the well-being of Irish people today. Their interest is entirely self-serving, of course. So what is interesting here in this novel is that, okay, it could be a sort of, oh, corruption is bad, give the power back to the people type of stuff. And that would be fine enough in itself, as it were, but it might not then mark out such a novel. What here marks out this novel is that at the time, in the 90s, 80s, 90s, Ireland was already part of the European Union. Ireland was, in fact, one of the first countries to join the European Union. So, Bolger is also interested here in looking at the relationship between Ireland, a peripheral country in terms of finances and geography, on the outskirts of Europe, the ties between Europe and Ireland. How does such a small country, at the time not doing that well in terms of financial weight on the market, as it were, how does a country like Ireland express itself? What is a country like Ireland in the context of, the discrepancy between big countries like France and Germany, tourism, how does one attract money, basically, to make the country grow, and in which direction does the country want to go, which was a real question in the 80s and the 70s. So what we realize is that basically there are multiple layers here, not only of involvement in terms of groups and people outside, but also multiple layers in terms of the relationship between all those levels. That is what Shay, Haino's friend, narrator's friend, we'll find out when he gets involved, caught up in some sort of low-life criminal activity involving him going to Europe. And that's what Shay will discover. Basically, the corruption is not simply Irish. The corruption is everywhere, and the corruption touches upon all aspects of their surroundings. Now, what is very interesting here is that, additionally, as it were, in terms of there is the political landscape and all this, there is at the heart of this the question of, well, what is it to be Irish these days? That is, in the 80s, 90s. What does it actually mean to be Irish? It used to be easy. We were against the English. We were not the English. But that can only work so far. And 80s, 90s, there is the beginning of an economic boom in Ireland. The political landscape is hugely dominated by one political party. And unfortunately, that seems to be very constricting in terms of defining what it is to be Irish in this modern world. How does one look outside? What does one say about oneself? How does one know what one is? And so that's really the second or the last third, perhaps, of the novel really tackles that question of identity in terms of Ireland. Is identity, as very often, of course, in cases like this, is identity to be found in the past, to be found perhaps in an idealized representation of nature, the countryside? Can identity grow? Can identity take hold in an urban environment which is both multicultural but also, again, corrupted and therefore making it difficult to progress or to grow, of course, in such an environment? So these are some aspects of why this novel is interesting in itself, because of all those themes around Ireland, around identity in general, around becoming. It is, of course, a sort of coming-of-age type of novel in the sense that Haino grows throughout. He has no choice. He's under great pressure and great danger, in fact. But as he grows, he asks himself these questions, because as he grows and as he goes, he meets all those different groups, all those different people who have different interests, and none of them seems to be interested in the general interest. And so those aspects make that novel not only interesting in itself, again, but interesting in the sense that, of course, it reminds us that a novel can be an instrument, can be a vehicle for a political message, to bring about a certain view of the world. Of course, there have been many, many such novels in the past. If you are interested in Irish fiction, right about that time, Pat McCabe's The Butcher Boy came out. And we'll say a quick word, not necessarily about this novel later on, but about that type of new voices in Ireland. Butcher Boy is also a pretty strong sort of political novel. It's absurd, it's shocking, it is very amusing, but at the same time, it is obviously written as an expression of a set of interrogations about identity and about what it is to be Irish in the 90s. In terms of political novels of a different kind, I just would like to mention Ian M. Banks' The Culture series. That's science fiction, mind you. Ian M. Banks was a Scottish writer, and he wrote both mainstream novels, The Crow Road, exceptional youth novel, and science fiction under the name of Ian M. Banks, and his series, The Culture novels, all have different titles, but they all take place within the same idea of the universe, as it were. In those novels, on the surface, again, they are, of course, a sort of sci-fi, lots of things happening, funny dialogues. He writes extremely well, and they are just very interesting books in themselves. But they are also heavily political in the sense that two civilizations oppose one another. The culture, the name suggests something already, and the other one is the machine. And what is very interesting with political novels like Ian M. Banks, The Player of Games, for example, or consider Phlebas, is that he's not simply interested in saying, yeah, the culture is great because look, people think, people love, people No, he's interested in looking at different aspects of the culture and the machine as being opposed views on society, and not simply being for one against the other, but actually thinking about both in relation to one another as well. So you can go a long way with a political novel. Now, one very important aspect of the political landscape in The Journey Home is Dublin. So that's the second aspect today that we want to mention, is when a city becomes a character in a novel. And what does that do and why is that? Now here, the city is Dublin, and Dublin is very interesting, and it's not the only one, obviously, it happens everywhere, but in that case, again, Dublin is interesting because, as I said in the beginning, his parents come from the countryside. And so his parents they're not comfortable in Dublin. Dublin for them is sort of a giant urban center that they simply do not recognize, in fact, as being part of who they are. This is not Ireland for them. Being Irish, being in Ireland, is the countryside they come from. So they live on the outskirts of the city in what is effectively a sort of semi-village. So people try to hold on to their traditions. Whichever county they come from, they carry with them in that sort of halfway town. But they're not really urbanized in that sense. Haino himself moves to the lower class, working class suburbs of Dublin, where he meets an infinitely more complex society, obviously, simply because there you've got people from everywhere and you've got lots of different backgrounds which are not necessarily anchored in the countryside. And of course, throughout the novel, he will move to the city itself. Now, what is Dublin? Well, Dublin is relatively small by, say, world or European standards, but Dublin is still complex enough. And in that sense, what is very interesting here is that Dublin acquires a set of characteristics that influence the narrative, that influence the narrator, that influence all the characters. The city is not simply a reflection of who they are or an echo of who they are, which it is also, of course, but it is also an active influence on the characters. Haino discovers, for example, that what he thought he knew extremely well, all the streets of Dublin, all the back streets where the tourists never go, in fact, he doesn't know at all, because there is a sub-layer to all this. There is an underbelly of Dublin, a criminal world that he knew nothing about. and that just by stepping to the next street, he realizes that here exists a whole city that I knew nothing about. At the same time, the city is also constraining in terms of space, obviously, so its social internal divisions can only go so far. In other words, it is very easy to go from a criminal's house to a high ranking politician's house to a middle class house, all in the space of a few streets. Now, suddenly, Dublin is very small. It's a pool out of which you can't really move, and yet, wherever you go, you find ways of escape. You find ways of escape, for example, to the north, that is Northern Ireland, of course. You find ways to escape, that is lines running between parts of Dublin and Europe, parts of Dublin and England, parts of Dublin and America. And here the city really takes on, of course, a multi community type of aspects, but that is not really what Bolger is interested in the sense of he's not really interested in showing a picture of a multicultural city, for example, which at the time anyway in Dublin was probably not exactly the case. He is interested in showing Dublin as an active participant in the creation of those groups inside of itself. And so the city here is a character as much, to some extent at least, as much as the real characters, one could say. This is not a new concept, of course. One could go back, if one wanted to, very far in the history of writing. We could go to the 19th century, of course, from Zola in Paris to Flaubert in Normandy, a small town, big town, small town, Dickens, of course, and that type of settings. And the setting in Flaubert, for example, is static, even though, of course, the setting itself, as a social setting, deeply influences Mme Bovary in this case, obviously. But here, what we're talking about is more a city that becomes part of the narrative itself as a setting and as a set of, for example, architectural places. So here we can think immediately, and I do not want, of course, to end up with a long list of cities, but some of the books that I really like, where the city plays that sort of role as a character itself. Auster, of course, the New York trilogy, the country of lost things, sort of post-apocalyptic New York, very interesting. And Jemisin, obviously, the female African American writer. Okay, it's not our best books by far, the series on New York. If you can get hold of her volume of short stories, How Long Until Black Month, exceptional book of short stories, and there's New York is quite present in those. In fact, New York is very present in those short stories as well. Lesson Zero, Easton Ellis, of course, Los Angeles. Los Angeles here is really at the heart of the story as well. We could think about High Rise, the Ballard book, obviously, where this time the division is very social. It's a vertical city, but it's the same idea, obviously. But here the division it's a three-way division, echoing the English class system perhaps, and that is, in this sense, Dublin in A Journey Home goes a little bit beyond that. Borges, of course, on Buenos Aires. In science fiction, you could think about examples. There are millions of examples in science fiction, but Perdido Street Station by Gianna Mieville is a great example of an imaginary city. La Vie Tidar Central Station, a sort of projection in the future based on Tel Aviv, but very interesting writer. Of course, I would have to talk about or mention Robert McLean Wilson, Eureka Street, a comic novel from the 90s set in Belfast. And so perhaps it's closer to Jonathan Coe's What a Carve Up here, because that novel, William Wilson's novel, is set in Belfast. It's a comic novel, it's a funny novel, but at the same time it takes into account how Belfast is divided between those two camps, where you can go, where you can't go, and how that influences the characters and what they can do and what they can imagine doing, in fact. That if I'm on the subject of Macmillan Wilson, he wrote and perhaps too heavily Martin Amis inspired stylistically book, but nevertheless a very interesting novel, Ripley Bogle it's called, and Ripley Bogle is a homeless from Belfast living on the streets of London. So he keeps, and of course London is also here a major character in the novel. I mean, there would be so many more. The Search, I have to mention The Search finally by Jeff Dyer, because in The Search it's not one city, it's he visits like 20 or 30 different cities, and it's a very small book, by the way, and all of them represent more an aspect of cities or urbanization in general. Wonderful book, The Search. So in all those novels, really, the city is not simply a setting or a static environment in which things happen. The city participates to what happens, is part of what happens. So finally, we have to say a very brief word in relation to that, because Dublin is a very important, has always been an important magnet in Irish history, by virtue of being very large and where most of the population, or a large part of the population, still lives. It's Irish fiction. What is interesting about The Journey Home beyond itself as a novel, which again I remind you is it's a very good novel. Well, Bolger came out so a little bit earlier, at the tail end of the 80s, with 2 or 3 additional novels before that, I think. He came out at the time full of very exciting new voices in Irish fiction. And I'm talking about the Republic of Ireland, and I'm talking about fiction in English exclusively, because there is fiction in Irish, in the Irish language, but unfortunately I'm not able to read that. Not in the Irish, at least. So what did we have in Ireland? Well, like many places, of course, there is the weight of tradition that weighs heavily on the shoulders of the young generation. That's everywhere the case. And in Ireland, what that meant really is that until the 80s, mid 80s and 80s, you had, first of all, a political climate, a cultural climate perhaps, that was still strongly influenced by the last remnants of the Civil War that led to Irish independence at the beginning, the first 20, 30 years of the 20th century. Famous 1916, of course, episode between England and Ireland in Dublin. And so you had this, of course, the historical stuff, his centuries-old opposition to England. You still had a very, very important presence and weight of the Catholic Church, both in education and in public and private life, of course. And from a cultural, literary perspective, you had some really, really big names to contend with. Of course, Yeats, if you're a poet or a playwright, and Joyce, obviously, right? And then also some of the really important names, Synge, O'Casey, Brian Friel, all those authors. Now, Joyce, of course, weigh very heavily because it's a looming presence, and as you know very well, I'm sure Joyce left Ireland, I think, at the tail end of his teens, and came back only once, maybe. Lived out the rest of his life, in Paris, for example, or certainly in Italy, where he died. So, and Joyce, of course, famously, I think in the Dubliners, if I'm not wrong, might be Portrait, but I'm not sure anymore. I'm sorry about this. Of course, famously rejected sort of Ireland, saying Ireland is dead. There's nothing there. It's emptiness. I have to go somewhere else if I want to live. So all this was a very strong presence, looming shadow on all new Irish voices. The 90s So a slew of new writers bring new voices, and through those new voices, what is much more interesting for us is new identities. And again, we go back to the Journey Holmes idea, which is, what is it to be Irish? One of the ideas. What is it to be Irish? What is it to be Irish today, with all that stuff in the background? Well, for example, you had this absolutely first top-rate writer, who's very famous today, Colm Tóibín, a gay man who wrote exquisite novels right from the beginning. The South, it might be his first novel, so you might not look at it as favorably as I do. Now, I really like this novel. But also in his third or fourth novel, I can't quite remember, tackling the problem of AIDS head on. And perhaps you don't know that, but homosexuality was not decriminalized until the 1990s in Ireland. So being gay in Ireland, that was one thing, difficult thing, not easy thing, but being able to speak with that voice or address those identities was something completely new, and he wasn't the only one. So you had some weird stuff coming out. You also had a more not comic exactly. Joseph O'Connor, for example, started out as a journalist. Now he's really into large epic and family stuff, sagas. But he started out in the 90s with a few very Irish novels, and short stories are really, really good. And again, what is it to be young in Ireland, with the way of the church, with the way of politics, with the absence of perspective. And what's always been very important in Ireland that you should know about or always think about is the importance of emigration. That is literally millions of Irish who over the last 200 years, 250 years, have emigrated to America, England, Australia, the rest of the world, etc. And also that weighs heavily. So Tóibín, of course, Joseph O'Connor, people like that. Me personally today, who do I think is incredible? Well, you've got to say John Banville. If you look at the early novels in the 90s of Banville, the Book of Evidence, Copernicus, Kepler, these are just masterpieces. Not only stylistically, but just in building. And again, the Book of Evidence, I think, could very well be also read as a metaphor on the state of Ireland and England. The main character being a very posh Oxford type educated Englishman, who basically rapes and desecrates metaphorical Ireland. Beautiful novel. Kepler and Copernicus are just masterpieces. Talking about masterpieces, Sebastian Barry, A Long Way. So again, looking at the 1914, 1918, so First World War type, with a unique voice, with a voice that speaks. I mean, it's amazing what he manages to do in writing, Sebastian Barry. Barry is, of course, also has always been interested in the past, or in the sort of where does Ireland come from, and you see that in a masterpiece. It's just an unbelievable, I think, novel, The Secret Scripture. The style is incredible, but the themes that he weaves in, the ideas about Ireland are it's magnificent novel. Jemisin, of course, if you like poetry, you can't really do without Heaney. I would like to mention, because I could go on, there's some really, really wonderful writer, Eugene McCabe, is a great writer as well. John McGahern, of course, Amongst Women, a perfect novel, I think. Hard, some might say bleak, but perfect novel, and also a novel again on the state of things. And McGahern, of course, had strong personal links with the 1916 type of politics. I would like to mention, I mentioned earlier, Robert McLean Wilson, who's a Belfast author. Just for the aficionados of science fiction among you, in 1996, I looked it up, Sacrifice of Fools was published by somebody who's gone on to make a really big name in science fiction circles for himself, Ian MacDonald. At the time, I haven't checked, but he must have been really young. I'm not sure it's still in print. What is interesting about that novel is that it is set in Belfast, and aliens arrive, and instead of going to, I don't know, Washington typically, or London, they come to Belfast. And what do they find in Belfast? Well, they find a city which is divided between those two factions, who hate one another, who cannot stand the sight of one another. So how can you hope to reconcile those two opposed factions, the loyalist and nationalist, the Protestant, the Catholic? How can you reconcile them? Can the aliens perhaps play a role? And they do. Highly recommend it. I don't know how good it is stylistically. I have a very good memory of it, but just the theme itself is enough to go and buy that novel if you can. So in conclusion, what can we say? Well, The Journey Home was a novel that made quite a big splash in Ireland at the time, because all those questions about Irish identity, about corruption, talking openly about what everybody knew but nobody really dared talk about, on the cusp of the 1990s, which will see a great deal of change in Ireland as well. A female president for the first time, was also a lawyer and pro-abortion and pro-divorce, all things that were not possible up until the mid-90s in Ireland. You could not have an abortion. Family planning was also very difficult to get by up until the 90s. Recognition of the rights of homosexuals in the 90s as well. All those things happened just as a continuation of that novel. So that novel really expressed a great deal of social concerns that the youth had, that the young people had, a feeling perhaps of being constricted, of being prisoner of an object that had been defined for them culturally, historically, and in which perhaps they felt that they had little part to play or were not asked to play a part. So it made a big splash. It was very much debated because of all those themes. And again, it's also representative of that new stream of wonderful new voices in Irish fiction in the 90s. And for all those reasons and more, and for just the quality of the novel itself, I can only recommend that, as usual, you go to your local bookshop. You try to find that book. If you can't find it, you order it. That will help them, bookshops live, and you will get yourself a wonderful novel, a great time reading it. And yeah, that's all we can hope for. Thank you very much.